Our first speaker, thank goodness, wonderful person, Dr. Anne-Marie Christopherson, who is a senior scientist at GNS Science, New Zealand, and also the team leader of the Earthquake Physics and Statistics team. Anne-Marie has been on the board of ABNMS since 2016 and was the president of 2019, and she'll be speaking on forecasting volcanic eruptions from observational data. Anne-Marie, over to you, please.
Those people who've attended ABNMS meetings before have seen me talk about volcanoes before. I'm a very part-time Bayesian network modeler, and so this work is also about a very part-time one. In the past, I usually there wasn't a lot of data, so I had to work with expert elicitation. In this particular case, I'm really excited about having some data to learn the Bayesian network from. And one thing that makes me also excited about working on natural hazards as well as for GNS science is that we have this amazing image library to kind of go through and find good photos for the talk. So this is an eruption of Mount Ruapehu that I'm going to talk about from the 19th of June 1996. And my collaborators on this work, I'll go to the next slide, Craig Miller, Yannick Beer, Rob Buxton. Craig and Yannick, they are both volcanologists and working in the volcanology team. And Rob Buxton has been a colleague at GNS. He's the one who first started getting me into Bayesian networks. So what we see on the map here is a screen grab that I did from the GeoNet website. And on the volcanoes, it shows the volcanoes that we have we're very active on the Pacific Rim of Fires and have a whole band going through the North Island. And I'm going to talk about Mount Ruapehu, which is the highest mountain in the North Island at the moment on activity level 1. So the outline of the talk is that I'm going to give you a little bit of a background and motivation for this work. Then I show you the data that I've got for Mount Ruapehu, which is an eruption catalog since the 1830s. The last eruption we had was in 2007. Then I'm going to talk about the crater lake temperature, where we've got measurements since the 1950s. We've got tremor, which are seismic signal measurements since 2008, and sporadic gas data since 2003. And we'll look at the initial Bayesian network and talk about next steps, conclusion, and outlook. The model is relatively simple compared to other models that we've seen, but one thing that I kind of like that Stephen talked about doing things online, this one was also an online only kind of interaction. So Craig and Yannick approached me in about March, and they had some measurements and they had done some statistics on it and wanted to see whether that made all sense. And long before they knew it, they had a Bayesian network. So that's how it came about. And we had only once a week meetings for an hour on Zoom, and have managed to pull that together during that time with a little bit of extra in between. So the background and motivation is that GeoNet is the program within GNS Science that where the volcanologists sit, and their task is to analyze and do the volcano monitoring and provide geological advice to government agencies. They regularly estimate the eruption probabilities for volcanoes in unrest. And usually the time windows are 28 or 91 days, but it can be more frequent, if there's a crisis. From those eruption probabilities, where people have intuitive models for, there's the study by Natalia Dillon, who calculates hourly risk of fatality. And those are taken from other kind of high risk professions around the world, and they determine the level of sign-off that is required for our colleagues to go and do some field work. Now, as you know, the challenge is to estimate, now I've undone my screen, completely gone into blackout. I'm back. So the challenges with small probabilities is that they're very difficult to estimate, as well as that it's very difficult in your mind to integrate different strands of data. So the idea was to trial a Bayesian network and to create a model context. And that is similar to what we've got in earthquake forecasting, which is more my home domain and where I spent more time. So looking at the data now, We have here the eruption catalog, just the number of eruptions per year over time. There, as I said, about 600 eruption documented, but they're unlikely to be complete because it's quite sparsely populated around the volcano. So the further we come in time, the more complete will our record be. Now the data, Brad Scott, a colleague who kind of compiled this, came also up with this eruption scale. This is very specific to Mount Ruapeo and describes the different observations. So for illustration, I've got two pictures from 1981 showing a sulfur slick on top of the crater lake, as well as showing a small phreatic eruption. I should use my mouse over there. And so what we are interested in for this forecasting is in everything that's larger than scale 3, which means that the eruption would impact beyond the crater rim. So if we look at that and look at the activity scale with time, then we see that it's much more densely, that graph in the later years, which is a completeness thing. And then also that a lot of eruptions seem to occur in clusters. And what we want to know is to in 91 days or having one or more events. So we decluster for this analysis. So this plot on the left-hand side shows the number of eruption versus the decluster interval. So if you look at the number of scale 3 and larger, we have about 90, and with the declustering window, we have 49 eruptions left. And on the other side of this slide, you see the 91-day eruption probability dependent on the decluster window. So we end up at 14 days, we're at about 8%. Now, this is now the data from the crater lake. So as I was saying, that we had people kind of starting to climb up and measure it from the 1950s, but at the beginning, the data was very sporadic. So if you see kind of long slopes like here, then it would have been interpolated between different measurements. In more recent times, the data is measured several times a day. So for the more recent times, we averaged per day, and for earlier times, we extrapolated between measurements so that we have a total of more than 24,000 daily measurements. So if we look at that in temperature bins, initially we had some anecdotal evidence from and kind of gut feeling from the volcanologist and observations that below 15 degrees at very cold temperatures is more likely to have an eruption, and at higher temperatures. So that's how we binned the data initially. But when we looked at that, there's only evidence that it's really higher eruption probability for high temperatures. So we decided to bin the data more equally so that each of the low, medium, and high temperature bins have similar amount of data. Now we are interested in an interruption interval between the next 7 and 91 days. So the temperature might change during that time. So we also introduced a temperature trend, which we calculated from the data between consecutive measurements. And we also binned that into 3 windows: a fast positive, a slow positive, and a negative. Now getting to the data that is more recent. So one of them is the tremor, which is measured as a seismic amplitude average. So for that, you need broadband stations. These measurements are very specific to a particular station, where it is located in respect to the volcano, and also what sensors in the station. So there was a particular station, DRZ, active from 2008 to 2017. And a more recent station was active, MAVZ, since 2013. And we were able to extrapolate between those two and kind of match the data so that we have 4,500 daily values for that. But since it only started in 2008, we don't have any eruptions in it at all since the latest was in 2007. So it's only good for informing the background probability for having no eruption. Then also we have gas measurements. So we have about 100 to 114 observations since 2003, the number varying depending on the number, on the different gases. Usually it's a gas flight. It's quite a snapshot in time, but we are working on having continuous gas measurements on the volcanoes as well. So in the future, that might be quite an informative piece of information as well. So yes, so I said it's similar to the tremor data, it can be used to inform the conditional probabilities for no eruption, but not for yes eruption, because we don't have any eruption during that time of the observations. So if we put that all together, so we have here the measured, can you see the mouse? Is that okay? Okay, if you're not, or Bruce, yes, great, thank you. So here's the measured temperature, the temperature trend going into a maximum or minimum temperature in that time interval, and then calculating the eruption probability. So the left-hand part of the Bayesian network is all learned from the 24,000 or so daily measurements that we have. And it was really exciting to just press a button and out come the conditional probability tables. And then the right-hand side, we use just the no eruption to inform it. I'd like to just say a couple of words or a couple of sentences more on the software. So the volcano monitoring team has now, like when I started working with them, the data was not very easily accessible, but they have now the data in a very good format and can query them quite easily. So they can automatically distract information, also feed in real-time measurements. So we've got a software package where we can read that in, update the Bayesian network, and this is called Basebox. Is going straight onto a website where the people who need to look at that and make decisions can see that and then conditionalize the network and play around and play, it says up here available 3 models there for different time intervals, so you can go in there. So that has been, quite an exciting piece of software to be acquired that made it really quite easy to put these things together. On the next slide, I look at the probability of eruption probability, yes, and this is basically just showing what we have seen, I think, in one of Bruce's slide. When there's no information, it's just equal for all, and so that in this part we can definitely do much better. And so if I now flick on to next steps, we have been discussing this, taking expert elicitation just for those particular node. So one of the things we have kept the volcano monitoring in the loop while we were developing it, and had a couple of show and tells. And the next thing we're going to do is to have a workshop to get specific feedback on the model parameters and then modify the model accordingly. Use some expert elicitation for those tremor and gas data for the probability of eruption, and then testing the model for robustness with varying parameters. We can also do a comparison with regular expert elicitation, which has been happening since 2014. And initial indications show that they are on the conservative side, that they are a bit lower than the long-term ones that we get out of the Bayes model. And then we'd like to apply the method to other volcanoes. And one thing we've been talking about for quite some time is that modeling with continuous data. And that was the challenge before, when we had expert elicitation and had quite small bins, and people found it just impossible to define thresholds. But yeah, the automatic learning doesn't care about the thresholds, they just does it. Okay, so conclusion and outlook. So I'm still convinced that BNs offer a flexible framework to address questions in volcano monitoring and volcanic hazard and risk assessment. And it's really great to have a data series, to have the BN learn the CPTs, and having also really good software tools. So that makes it relatively easy to put things like this together, even if there are time pressures on other things, and there's still heaps to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. All right, I'll start off the bandwagon here, folks. Okay, Anne-Marie, this is what I wrote to you. Sometimes Random events tend to cluster in space or time randomly. Are the clusters of eruption events random, or are they causally related? And if they're causally related, does the BN account for some sort of mechanism causing the clustering and thereby helping to increase the accuracy of the model?
Okay, yes, so the first part of the question is yes, the volcanoes quiet when there's no magma rising. And so it's always an interaction of material coming up and interacting on its way to the surface with whatever comes along the way. And so that's the reason for the declustering, is that there's an active period. We haven't gone as far as trying to model that. And I'm not too sure whether we have our data series is quite large enough, but it would be an interesting thing to be looking at.
Well, in that case, Dr. Christofferson, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And
thank you.
Let's go to number 2. And we're very, very happy and pleased and honored to have Annelie Dorf. Annelie Dorf is a PhD student at the University of Melbourne in the Fire Ecology and Biodiversity Group. Her research focuses on how landscape patterns of fire influence mammal and reptile communities relative to landscape patterns. Side point, she and I met the last time I was down in Australia when I twisted my ankle and sprained it terribly, and she was pushing me in a wheelchair at the airport. So thank you for that. She probably
I had forgotten about that, Bruce.
Yeah, she probably understandably. Annelie will be speaking on spatial patterns in landscape features drive vertebrate diversity. So over to you, please, Annelie.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Annelie Dorf, and I'm a PhD candidate with the University of Melbourne. And today I'm talking to you about how some landscape spatial pattern features drive a reptile and a mammal community in 2 different parts of Victoria. So I'd first like to start with acknowledging my co-authors, Julian DeStefano, Matthew Swan, Trent Penman, Ellen Rockelmeyer, Holly Sitters, and Sarah Mulhall. And I'd also just like to acknowledge the Wadawurrung, Gadabanud, Gunditjmara, and Djadjawurrung peoples, who are the traditional custodians of the land where this research was conducted. So in natural landscapes, there's a number of ecological features that can drive spatial patterns in vegetation, which can affect reptile and mammal communities. So the first of which would be topography, but also climatic drivers can affect these communities. However, there's also a number of human driven elements, such as land clearing for agriculture and plantation purposes. So for land managers who want to manipulate or enhance these communities, there's really only one environmental driver that they can use to change spatial pattern in the landscape, and that is fire. So what do I mean when I refer to spatial pattern? Well, the first, there's 2 components, the first of which is landscape composition. And this is a measure of what and how much of the landscape is made up of different habitat types. So it could be the variety and abundance of different habitat patches in the landscape. So for example, in this image on the left, we've got 3 fairly evenly distributed patch types in the landscape. So proportionally, if you're using a proportional measure of abundance, you've got a more even or uniform landscape. Whereas if we remove this blue patch area, then we've suddenly got a landscape that's skewed in the patch size towards this white habitat area. So when I refer to landscape composition today, I'm really referring to something along the lines of evenness or uniformity of the landscape. The second measure that we use to define landscape spatial pattern is landscape configuration, and this is an indication of how different patches in the landscape are arranged. So again, if we have our example landscape here on the left, landscape configuration can be a measure of the number of edges, or maybe a difference in the patch types on either side of an edge, so a contrast between the edges. And today, when I refer to landscape configuration, that's pretty much what I'm referring to, is the number or contrast between edges in the landscape. And these measures have important implications for how resources are distributed for species and how accessible different resources are to species. So this brings me to my key question for my talk today, which is how does spatial pattern in fire compared to spatial pattern from other environmental variables affect a mammal and a reptile community in Victoria? And I used 2 separate case studies to look at this question. So the first case study was conducted in the Otway Ranges of Victoria, which is on the south coast of Victoria. It's about a 57,000 hectare area of pretty continuous natural forest, where we had about 187 sites that we sampled both mammal species at and also the habitat structure it sites at. And we wanted to know how a number of different environmental variables affected these species in the landscape. So the first of this was elevation. The second variable was we used was an aridity index, which is a measure of dryness in the landscape. So that was our climatic factor. We had soil clay content as a measure of differences in soil type across the landscape. We used NDVI, or normalized difference in vegetation index, to indicate productivity variation across the landscape, which can be a substitute for a vegetation type. To measure fire history in the landscape, we had a time since fire layer. And finally, we used the habitat variables that we measured at each site to predict habitat structure across the landscape, which gave us a measure of how much vegetation essentially there was throughout the landscape. And so we wanted to use a BayesNet to look at how each of these variables were related, but more importantly, how they impacted mammal species richness. So to do this, we used UniNet, developed by Lighttwist Software, and looked at each of our composition variables in the composition metrics for each of our variables. And on the right-hand side here, we also had the configuration metrics for each of our variables. So in the graph that I'm about to show you, we've also got mammal species richness down the bottom. And we also included SLRV, which was a spatially lagged response variable to account for autocorrelation between our sites. So we used known relationships between our variables to build our BayesNet, and used essentially the model to guess essentially what the correlations between the variables were. And when the correlation was below 0.1, we removed that arc between our variables in this model. So in this BayesNet here, we've got the blue lines indicating, the blue lines indicating the positive relationships, the orange lines indicating negative relationships, and the size of these lines indicates how strong the correlation between variables was. So if we just look at how mammal species richness was affected by each of these variables, in this graph here, we've got our Bayes rank correlations indicating the strength of the effect, the correlation with the variable on the x-axis, and on our y-axis, we have each of the predictor variables and whether the variable was a composition or configuration metric indicated by the color of the bar. And the bars that are filled in indicated direct relationships with mammal species richness. So there's a few variables that I just wanted to focus on here. The first of which was NDVI configuration, which was the strongest driver of mammal species richness in this landscape. The second driver that I'm going to focus on today is the time since fire composition variable. And I'll go into a bit more detail about what these variables mean and how they affect mammal species richness in a second. But I also just wanted to point out that habitat complexity composition was also a very important variable for mammal species richness. So what did NDVI, a strong NDVI configuration correlation with mammal species richness mean? Well, in this landscape on the left here, we've got a low NDVI configuration. So you can see that most of the landscape is made up of similar shade of dark blue. And there's not really any edges present in this landscape. Whereas on the right, we've got a landscape where there's lighter areas and darker areas present in the landscape. And you can see almost along here, there's an edge present. And so we had lower mammal species richness within this landscape on the left and a higher mammal species richness in this landscape on the right. And this was about a 45% increase. So mammals were more present in greater numbers where there was perhaps a gully present in the landscape or a change in productivity as vegetation types within the landscape changed. For the time since fire index composition variable, we had low composition of a time since fire index indicate there was greater uniformity in the landscape. So you can see that this landscape is dominated by a pale blue color, and a greater composition, a higher composition variable indicated lower uniformity. So there's a greater mix of fire ages in the landscape, and there's not really any dominant fire age. And we had lower mammal species richness in low composition areas and higher mammal species richness in landscapes with higher composition. And this was also about a 40% increase in mammal species richness for these landscapes with more even distribution or a lower uniform distribution of fire histories in the landscape. So the second case study that I wanted to talk to you about was a reptile study that we conducted further inland along the South Australia-Victoria border. And this landscape was a very fragmented landscape broken up by agriculture and plantation. And we had about 107 sites that we sampled reptile species richness, and also, again, we sampled habitat structure at these sites. So we used pretty much the same design as we used for the mammal study, where we had our environmental predictors, but we also added in a measure of the proportion of remaining native vegetation in the landscape. And there are a number of other things that we included in this model. So for starters, we had more habitat variables that we included. So not just an overall measure of habitat structure, but we also included estimates of canopy cover through the landscape, of basal area through the landscape, how much leaf litter there was in different parts of the landscape, an estimate of bare ground through the landscape, and also estimates of low vegetation structure. And this led to a slightly more complex phase net where we've got all of these habitat variables along the bottom here. But we also included a lot of individual species responses. So for simplicity today, I'm not going to be talking about all of these extra habitat variables or the species responses. I'm just going to focus on species richness. So again, if we draw the BayesNet, the simplified BayesNet, we have our composition metrics for each of the environmental predictors on the left here, and the configuration metrics on the right. But because of the land clearing in the landscape, we've also got the proportion of remaining native vegetation. And again, down the bottom, we have our reptile species richness. So following the similar method, we built this model in UniNet based on known relationships, and then removed any arcs where there was correlation less than 0.1. So again, the blue lines indicate positive relationships and the orange lines indicate negative relationships, and the thickness of the line indicates the strength of the relationship. And you can see there's really only one variable directly affecting reptile species. So if we look at how these variables affected reptile species richness, we've again got a graph with our Bayes rank correlation on the x-axis and each of our predictor variables on the y-axis. And in this graph, again, I think it's the blue bars indicate composition and the orange bars indicate the configuration metric, and the filled in bar indicates a direct relationship. So you can see that habitat complexity composition is the only direct relationship. However, another variable I just wanted to quickly point out was this proportion of remaining native vegetation, and you can see that it's got a positive correlation with species richness. So there was higher reptile species richness in landscapes with more remaining native vegetation. And the only variable that I'm just going to quickly discuss in more detail again here is this habitat complexity composition variable, which had the strongest influence on reptile species richness in the model. So what does habitat complexity composition, a high habitat complexity composition and a low habitat complexity composition mean? Well, low composition is actually the inverse of what the time since fire measure was because of the different metric that was used. So you can see there's lower uniformity in the landscape, and there's greater diversity in the number of pixels and the color of the pixels in the landscape. Whereas a high composition landscape has pretty uniform patch type and it's all one color. So we had lower species richness in this high habitat complexity composition landscape, and a higher species richness where there was more diversity in the habitat. throughout the landscape. And this was about a 30% increase in landscapes, in these landscapes. So if we just go quickly and have a look at what our key question was again as a reminder, we wanted to know specifically how fire compared to each of these environmental variables relative to both mammals and reptile species richness. And so we can summarize it pretty briefly in here, where for mammals, NDVI, fire, and habitat complexity variables all had stronger effects on mammal species richness, whereas for reptiles, both habitat complexity and then land use had a greater influence on reptile species richness, with measures of fire and environmental variables having lower effects. That's the main conclusions that we had from our 2 case studies. In future, what we're aiming to do is build not just these landscape variables into the BayesNet, but also point-based variables. So what like fire history was at the actual site level, for example, and see if this can improve our models for land managers to work out how they can implement fire in the landscape for the management of these species. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you very much. I'm sitting here thinking we could use this sort of information and system for parts of Oregon and Washington and California that have been experiencing just intense, terrible fires here too. So we'll be in touch. Can we open it up to questions, please? Either in the chat box or verbally.
I was just wondering with your mammal study. Sorry, first of all, amazing slides. I love them. I thought they were the best. They were totally top. Super impressed with those. I just wanted to check that with your mammal studies, was it just terrestrial mammals or were there bats as well? I'm just thinking because in relation to like the edge effects and linear features and stuff as well.
Yeah, so we only used terrestrial mammals. We sampled using just camera traps across the landscape.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And just did you look at any measures of abundance or were you just looking at species richness?
We only used, so for the mammals, we only used species richness because of the ways the camera, with camera trapping, it's hard to say, take measures of abundance because you don't know if you're just like catching the same animal every night at a trap, or if it's, you know, there's 20 individuals of the same species at the same site. So we just use species richness.
Excellent, cool, thank you very much. Really great work.
Thanks.
And there's a question from Fabrice as well.
Hi, Annalie. Yeah, great talk. Really interesting stuff. I'm just wondering, so you've got a measure of richness in there, and you've got some real samples that you collected from the field. I'm just wondering whether you've considered estimates of turnover and whether you think that might have any kind of bearing on your model in terms of another diversity measure. So
yeah.
Turnover, change in species composition over space.
Yeah. So I have thought about this quite a bit, and if you have any suggestions, I'm open to hearing them, but I have no idea how to build it in, basically, because we did a site level study using a random forest model and generalized the similarity model where we could use those different diversity measures to do similar thing in a BayesNet. I haven't yet thought of a way of doing that. I'm open to suggestions.
If you use random forest, you might want to just look at gradient forests. It's an Australian method by Roland Pitcher.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Annalie, and outstanding talk. And you all love the graphics too, but content was actually superb too. We move on to Dr. Fabrice Stevenson. Honored and happy to have you here, sir. Dr. Stevenson works currently at the Center for Coasts and Oceans, National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research in New Zealand. He is a quantitative marine ecologist with interests in decision support tools to help with planning of marine spatial aspects. So Dr. Stevenson, over to you. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for that introduction, Bruce. Yep, so my name is Fabrice Stevenson. I'm presenting some work on behalf of my colleague, Dr. Richard Bulmer, who kind of led this work, as well as collaboration with Professor Judy Hewitt. So the research really focuses around developing a Bayesian network to kind of look at estuarine ecosystem health. So a lot of you will be familiar with Bayesian networks. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time in this presentation talking a bit about the background of estuaries, which some of you might not be so familiar with. So estuaries are partially enclosed bodies of water that have either a single or multiple freshwater inputs, and they have to have an open connection to the sea. So the areas where you get this interface of salt and freshwater, and that results in a really dynamic and rich ecosystem. And New Zealand is quite unusual in the sense that it has a lot of estuaries, a lot of quite large estuaries as well. And they're actually in quite good health, and they're used extensively for lots of different things. So lots of values and activities that are supported by estuaries in New Zealand, things that you might be familiar with, like climate regulation, life cycle and habitat provision, and things like coastal defense. There's some kind of more kind of financial links in terms of things like fisheries and agriculture, but there's also some really high cultural and spiritual values associated with estuaries in New Zealand, as well as things like tourism, shipping, energy, and mining. So with all of these kind of uses and values associated with it, there's some increasing threats to estuaries, anthropogenic threats. And we're specifically interested in looking at these multiple cumulative stresses. So in case you're not necessarily familiar with some of the terminology or jargon, stresses are physical factors that have an adverse effect or impact on the ecosystem or its biotic components. Oh. And so in an estuarine context, some kind of prime examples of stresses are things like sedimentation. So that's where you might have land use changes with increased sediment runoff from the land, and that increases the turbidity in the estuaries and makes the water a little less clear. Things like nutrient inputs. So if there's a lot of farming or intensive agriculture, or again, land clearing, you might get increased nitrates or phosphates running off the soil and entering into the estuarine system, and that can have knock-on effects like increased algal blooms or increased bacterial activity, all those kind of things. The usual culprit in the marine environment, fishing. So that's potentially too high levels of extraction of the target species, but also there can be impacts from the physical effects of fishing on the seafloor. And then there's these kind of longer term stresses, things like climate change, where we might see increases in temperature, or we might see increases in the frequency of heat waves, or the increase of freshwater runoff from increased rain. So there's all of these kind of stresses that may combine to create these kind of changed ecosystems. And there's actually quite a lot of uncertainty around how these stresses are interacting. So we're really interested in figuring out whether these stresses have a larger impact on the system than the individual sum of their parts. So we call that synergistic interactions, where we might have a really unusual and high impact when two or more of these stresses are kind of in the system. And that's quite important because kind of historically, a lot of these stresses have been managed in isolation or even researched in isolation. A lot of kind of research looking at individual components of the stresses that I've kind of talked about, but not so much about how they might be interacting and what that might mean for the ecosystem as a whole. So these kind of issues have been highlighted in a recent paper by a colleague, Rebecca Gladstone Gallagher, where she did a literature review to look at how people were assessing these cumulative impacts. And she basically concluded that there was a disconnect between some of the biophysical research that were looking at these single stresses and how the systems are managed from a practical level, and also how that interacts with society. And so one of her recommendations was that in the absence of the huge amount of data that we actually need to be able to start quantifying these cumulative effects, we might want to use expert opinion to start bridging that gap, before, in the meantime, while we continue to collect some of that data. And that would also allow things like socio-ecological feedbacks to be integrated. And they recommended basically that BNs might be a good tool to do this, because we can combine some of the real data that we have with some of the expert opinion data that we might be able to elicit to be able to look at some of those cumulative effects. So that's a bit of context for why we decided to develop the Bayesian network. And so in terms of actually kind of getting a structure together, we used expert opinion to develop a conceptual model and the links that might be within between the nodes. And we did this in a kind of an iterative process with some experts that weren't involved in the elicitation process for the second part, which was actually generating the conditional probability between the nodes, so the relationships between the variables. And we used the IDEA protocol, which was developed by our very own president of ABNMS to kind of to get some of those expert opinions on those relationships. So this is a diagram of the BN, but actually I've got a better one coming up, so we'll wait till we get to that. So we did have some real data available for some of these nodes. In the end, we decided not to use it to parameterize the relationships, and that was for mainly because we wanted to withhold it so that we could test how well the model was working in terms of an independent validation exercise. But we did use the data to define the state nodes, so that the experts had very clear guidelines on what we were considering our states to represent, and so that would represent kind of realistic values from an ecosystem perspective. And as I mentioned, so the model outputs were validated against some of the empirical data. So this is the structure of our model. I'm not sure if you can, the writings may be a little small, but the nodes at the top in blue, there are stressor nodes. So that's suspended sediments, mud content, nitrogen, and heavy metals. And they will have an effect on our nodes that are in green here, which are ecological community nodes. So in the marine context, things like macrofauna refer to animals that live on the seafloor. Benthic biodiversity is the diversity of these animals on the seafloor. And then we've got things like macroalgae and things like fringing vegetation, which relate to mangroves and seagrass and things like that. Importantly, we have a couple of nodes that we think are particularly important. Large suspension feeding bivalves. So these are kind of things like mussels and various other bivalves that live on the seafloor, and they're really important for a lot of the ecosystem functioning in estuaries, as well as ecosystem services, actually, things like food provision and other things. And then that feeds into our yellow nodes, which, if I can read the legend here, refer to our ecosystem functions. So things like how clear our water is, or whether we have high primary productivity or nutrient cycling in the estuary. And these are all things that are important to maintain within the ecosystem so that it kind of perpetuates itself. And right at the end here in purple, we have a couple of the ecological community nodes that we thought were particularly important. And we have them as a secondary step kind of being affected by our yellow and green nodes. So it's almost like a single time step. So a very simplified dynamic Bayesian network, but only for a couple of these nodes that we're particularly interested in. In terms of a time span, this is supposed to represent about 10 years worth. So the change would be over a period of 10 years. And the network represents an estuary as a whole, which can be a large place, which is why we might get quite a lot of differences spread out across the nodes. It's very unlikely to be 100% of large suspension feeding bivalves, because it's just not possible in the natural environment to have that side of things. It's patchy. So in terms of the results, we did quite a lot of sensitivity testing on this model, which we won't necessarily get into, but I just wanted to show this slide here where we compared the data that we had collected, so empirical data, with the predictions from the BayesNet. So in blue we have the predicted values from the BayesNet, and in grey we have the data, and we can see that there's some high concordance between those, and that provides us confidence that the overall model dynamics are working as they should, and that it's somewhat supported by these field observations, although there are limits to how many observations we have. So what we were really interested in is figuring out some of these looking at the multiple stressor interactions, sorry. And so this is just an example for shellfish, so large bivalves, being affected by two stresses, metals and mud, which go from very low to very high. And shellfish is measured as abundance that goes from very low to very high. And as you'd expect with our single stresses, if we're moving along the axis here, as we increase the stressor, we get an increased probability of being in a low or very low abundant state for shellfish. And that would be the same with our mud content. That's nothing particularly new. What we're really interested in is this middle section here, where we might have Can you see my pointer, by the way? Okay, so that middle section here is where what we're really interested in, because that's where we might get some of those interactions, where we might get a really large transition from, say, this prediction here, where we have moderate mud and moderate metals, where we have a dominance of low or very low probability occurrence of shellfish, compared to reducing the node of metals or mud by one state. We get a very large transition in terms of what we'd consider kind of a gain in terms of the ecology for the shellfish, in terms of trying to conserve them. So that's this portion of the model that we're particularly interested in from a management point of view, to be able to kind of try and give some recommendations. So we actually produced this model for the Parliamentary Commission for the Environment in New Zealand. And once that came out, there was a few of the regional councils that were pretty interested in giving it a go. And we're very lucky that the Hawke's Bay Regional Council was undertaking a restoration project where they were looking to reduce sediment and nutrient inputs in 2 of their estuaries. And so they're interested in putting in the data, their assessment monitoring data that they had collected over time into the model. First of all, seeing whether the model was kind of reflecting the data that they'd collected. And then if so, trying to assess whether some of the assumptions that they're making about what their restoration strategies might do, whether they are likely to be effective. So once we plugged the data into the model, we looked at some hypothetical management strategies where we reduced suspended sediments by 1 state, where we reduced suspended sediments, mud and metals by 1 state, and then where we reduced all of the stresses, including nitrogen, by 1 state. So in terms of the results, obviously the report was quite long, so this is just a very broad overview of what we found. But I guess the first thing was that in terms of putting in the local monitoring data, the BN model reflected the local conditions, which was a good start. And when we tested the various scenarios, we saw that there was some, or the model predicted that there were some large positive outcomes with relatively low changes in the stressor states. So for example, a reduction by 1 state of suspended sediments resulted in an increased likelihood of high or very high abundance of 2 of our really main kind of focuses, which are macrofauna biodiversity and the fish communities. And there was a 2-fold increase in one of the estuaries and a 3-fold increase in the other. And we saw kind of equally high increases in some of the ecosystem functioning relative to these baseline conditions. So that was quite nice to see, but also there was a higher probability of high or very high nuisance macroalgae if nitrogen wasn't also reduced. And that's associated with kind of increased water column penetration, but a high availability of nitrogen, which can lead to these kind of algal blooms, which can be quite bad for the ecosystem. So it was quite a nice example of being able to kind of see an indirect effect or a potential surprise. If we're not looking at the system as a whole, if we'd only looked at 1 or 2 stresses, we might not have been able to kind of pick up on the fact that the nitrogen levels were potentially too high in the estuary, and that it wasn't necessarily going to come into a really positive outcome. So just briefly to conclude, so we parameterized the BN using expert knowledge, and I guess it reflects the knowledge of estuarine ecosystem dynamics, and it does so in a probabilistic framework, which is really useful, I guess, for seeing where there are uncertainties. But I guess also for highlighting specific areas where we really are lacking empirical data that we should go and collect in the field. The BN was useful illustrating any kind of likely changes with these stresses. I say likely because these are kind of broad changes in direction, and these can help inform and support management decisions, especially looking at some of these trade-offs and maybe picking up on some of these indirect effects that can require some careful consideration. At the moment, the model doesn't really account for social or cultural values. It has ecosystem functioning, which can translate into ecosystem services, but that's not really been done yet. So that's definitely where we're kind of heading to next, is to try and make this a bit more of a social ecological model. So just very briefly, I'd like to acknowledge the expert workshop, or the expert members who attended the workshop, as well as Sustainable Seas, Auckland Council and East Coast for their data sets for validation. And our funding sources, NIWA, Coast and Oceans Programme, the Parliamentary Commission for the Environment New Zealand, and Hawke's Bay Regional Council. Thanks very much.
Very, very nice, Fabrice. Thanks very much for that. We have some questions. We've got some comments. I will ask one. Fabrice, you mentioned algal blooms, and I hit upon possible influence of climate change as causal factors for increase of those. Are you considering that as future stressors?
Yeah, so I think originally we did have climate change in there, but there's just so much uncertainty about how it might link into all these different aspects of the ecosystem that we decided we'd leave it out. I think it's definitely somewhere where we're likely to be putting in, considerable thought and potentially more research. And as you say, climate change is definitely linked to, or we think it's linked to these increased algal blooms. But it can be linked to all sorts of, die-offs of bivalves through kind of heat wave events. So there's all sorts of potentially quite serious implications to that we should look at including in the model. Yeah.
Very good, thank you.
And Anka had her hand up.
Did I? No, I think I just clapped as well.
Oh, sorry.
But I'll say what I said in chat. I'll say it here as well. And that's thanks, Fabrice, for giving me all the credit for the IDEA protocol. But it's not just me. It's a bunch of people from the SEBRA, from the University of Melbourne, that developed that protocol.
All right, if we have no more comments or questions, I want to personally thank Anne-Marie Christofferson, Annalie Dorf, and Fabrice Stevenson for your outstanding presentations, and especially the animations we saw. Thank you all very, very much.